Hi, my name is Susan Whitmore, and 3 months after my divorce, a cream-colored envelope slid under my front door. At first, I thought it was another bill, another reminder that life after Mark had been a slow unraveling of paperwork and overdue notices. But when I bent down and picked it up, I knew immediately this was different. Heavy cardstock, embossed lettering, the faint scent of roses pressed into paper that screamed money. I opened it carefully, my hands already trembling, and read the words no woman ever expects to see. You are cordially invited to the wedding of Mark Whitmore and Sophia Lane. Mark, my ex-husband, the man who had once whispered that I was his rock, his reason, his best friend. And Sophia, the young assistant from his law office with the too perfect smile, the one I had caught lingering too close to him at company holiday parties. She was now the bride. At the bottom of the invitation, in looping cursive, was a short note. We trust Susan will be discreet. Margaret Whitmore. Margaret, my former mother-in-law, always polished, always proper, and always convinced I was a poor match for her only son. She once told me I was a rescue project they had tried to civilize. That single line at the bottom of the invitation burned more than the announcement itself. They weren't just inviting me, they were warning me not to embarrass them, as if I were a problem to be managed, a stain they hoped to keep hidden under the rug while they displayed their picture-perfect family to the world. I sat there in my small Portland apartment staring at the letter as the late afternoon light faded through the blinds. Around me, bills were stacked like paper bricks on the counter. The refrigerator hummed, mostly empty except for a carton of eggs and a jar of mustard. My once lively orchid, a gift from a nursing colleague years ago, stood with brown petals curled in surrender on the windowsill. For the first time in a while, I let the silence sink in. Not the kind of silence that comforts, but the kind that reminds you just how alone you are. And yet, beneath the sting, something deeper stirred. Because what Margaret and Mark didn't know, what no one in that room of perfect wedding guests would know, was that I had been quietly building a life they never bothered to see. But I'll come back to that later. Before I tell you how I walked into that wedding and watched the color drain from every face, you need to understand where I was when it all began. The night I received the invitation, I was still in my scrubs from a double shift at the hospital. My hair frizzed from the Portland rain, and my shoes carried the faint smell of disinfectant. I had spent 14 hours tending to strangers, checking vitals, soothing frightened families, holding the hands of patients who had no one else. Then I came home to silence. There's a particular cruelty in pouring every ounce of yourself into others and returning to 4 blank walls that don't even echo your presence back. No laughter, no children running down the hallway, no one to ask how your day was. Just the steady tick of the clock on the kitchen wall, counting down the minutes of a life that felt smaller than it should have been. Mark had left me 6 months before, but the wounds were still fresh. His words echoed louder than the slam of the door. Susan, you're too ordinary. You don't fit the life I want, too ordinary. That was how he saw me. Not the years I supported him through law school. Not the double shifts I worked so he could focus on his career. Not the nights I stayed awake, balancing bills and cooking cheap meals that stretched further than they should. To him, I was plain, forgettable. Someone who didn't shine bright enough under the spotlight he craved. And Sophia? She was the opposite. Young, glamorous, the kind of woman who posted her brunches online with hashtags about living your best life. She laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny, leaned in close whenever he spoke, and made him feel like a man destined for more than me. I wasn't surprised when it ended. What surprised me was the invitation, the audacity, the cruelty masked as courtesy. I placed the envelope on the counter and stepped back like it might burn a hole straight through the laminate. For a long while, I just stood there, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a neighbor's TV through thin apartment walls. I thought about throwing it away, shredding it into 100 tiny pieces until nothing remained. But my eyes drifted to the bookshelf in the corner where a thick folder sat untouched for months. A folder labeled Whitmore Properties. They thought I was ordinary. They thought I was poor. They thought I would disappear quietly into the background of their perfect lives. But they were wrong. Very wrong. Long before the invitation arrived, the Whitmore family had made sure I knew exactly where I stood in their world. And it wasn't beside them. I'll never forget the first Thanksgiving I spent in their grand home. Margaret, my mother-in-law, greeted me at the door with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She looked me up and down, lingering on my shoes, plain black flats I had bought on sale after a 14-hour hospital shift. "No heels?" she asked sweetly, the kind of sweet that cuts sharper than bitterness. I laughed awkwardly, brushing off the sting. But when I walked into the dining room, I realized the table had been rearranged. Mark sat near the head beside his mother, glowing under her approving gaze, while I was placed at the far end next to a teenage niece, too absorbed in her phone to notice I existed. Dinner that night was a blur of polite conversations that excluded me. When I tried to join in, Margaret corrected me on my wording. "We don't say supper, dear, it's dinner." When I proudly presented a homemade pecan pie, a recipe from my grandmother, Margaret leaned over and whispered, "Such a quaint choice. We usually prefer something lighter." I remember standing in their gleaming kitchen afterward, scrubbing dishes alone while laughter echoed from the living room. That was the moment Mark's father slipped in, placed another plate in the sink, and said quietly, "Mark's going places, Susan. Try not to weigh him down with your little projects." Little projects? He meant my efforts to buy and fix old houses in struggling neighborhoods. To me, they were investments, a way to build stability for our future. To them, they were foolish hobbies of a woman who didn't understand her place. I swallowed the hurt, rinsed the plate, and stayed silent. That became my habit. Swallowing the comments, shrinking into the background, convincing myself that grace meant staying quiet. The humiliation wasn't limited to holidays. It was woven into everyday life. There was the Christmas party at Mark's law firm, where Sophia, yes, that Sophia, arrived in a sequined dress that sparkled under the chandeliers. She laughed at every joke Mark made, her hand brushing his arm as if I weren't standing right there. I wore a simple navy dress, the only one I owned that fit the occasion. I remember Margaret pulling me aside afterward. "Susan, you really should invest in a proper wardrobe. Appearances matter for someone in Mark's position." I wanted to scream that my money was tied up in medical school loans, in home repairs, in late-night grocery runs when Mark's credit card was maxed out, but I stayed quiet. Again. Then there was the scarf. I'll never forget it. One Christmas, Mark presented his mother with a gold cashmere scarf, the kind that came in a Nordstrom box. She squealed with delight, wrapping it around her neck as if it were a crown. I sat frozen because I recognized the charge when it hit our joint account later. $1,500. My holiday bonus gone in a single purchase I hadn't agreed to. I never confronted him. Instead, I smiled through the pain, did the dishes, and told myself it wasn't worth the fight. But the deepest cuts weren't the gifts or the snide remarks. They were the moments Mark himself revealed what he truly thought of me. One night after a long shift at the hospital, I came home to find him sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone. I asked if he wanted dinner, but he didn't look up. "Susan," he said, his tone flat, "sometimes I feel like you hold me back." I froze. "Hold you back? From what?" "From the life I want," he said finally, setting his phone aside. "You're too ordinary. I need someone who fits those words settled into me like lead. Ordinary. The kind of word that erases years of sacrifice in a single breath. I wanted to remind him of the nights I stayed awake, calculating how to pay the mortgage on his parents' investment property while still covering groceries. Of the times I skipped meals so we could stretch our budget. of the support I gave him through law school, the encouragement when he doubted himself, the pride I felt when he passed the bar exam. But what would it matter? He had already decided. He wanted a shinier life, and I wasn't part of it. When he finally left, it wasn't with a fight. There were no slammed doors, no shattered plates, just a cold emptiness in the middle of our living room where his things had once been. I stood among half-packed boxes, unpaid bills scattered on the table, and a refrigerator that hummed with nothing but ketchup and eggs. The silence was deafening, and yet, in that silence, a part of me hardened, because deep down I knew something Mark and his family didn't. I was not ordinary. I had been working, saving, planning, not for applause, not for recognition, but for security, for the kind of foundation they would never see coming. Still, at that time, all I felt was loss. Loss of the man I thought loved me. Loss of the family I tried so hard to belong to. Loss of the years I couldn't get back. That was where I was when the invitation arrived, and that's why, when I looked at that cream-colored envelope on my kitchen counter, I didn't just see cruelty. I saw a challenge. Because they thought I was invisible. They thought I was powerless. They thought I would stay silent forever. They were wrong. That invitation could have been the end of me. For a moment, I nearly let it be. I thought about ripping it to shreds, throwing it into the trash, and curling back into bed with nothing but the hum of the refrigerator to keep me company. But then my eyes drifted across the room to the bookshelf where a thick black folder sat, wedged between old nursing textbooks. The words, Whitmore Properties. Confidential glared from its worn spine. I hadn't touched that folder in months, maybe longer, not since Mark walked out the door. Part of me avoided it because it reminded me of him, of all the times he mocked my side project while chasing bigger dreams of his own. But another part of me, maybe I was afraid of what it might reveal. I crossed the room, slid the folder free, and placed it on the kitchen table. My fingers hesitated on the cover, the way you pause before opening a letter you know will change everything. Then I flipped it open. Inside were deeds, permits, mortgage documents with my name written across the top. Susan Whitmore. I ran my hands over the papers, the ink, the signatures. Memories rose up with each page. There was the first duplex I bought at a county auction, the one everyone said was beyond saving. I remembered scrubbing walls that smelled of mildew, fighting with contractors who assumed I was just a clueless nurse with no idea what drywall even was. I remembered the exhaustion of finishing a double shift at the hospital, then driving across town to check on leaky pipes and faulty wiring. But I had done it, quietly, patiently, and that duplex had turned into 2 more, then 4, then 6. I kept flipping through the folder, scanning appraisals, rental agreements, bank statements. Slowly, the weight of reality settled on me. These weren't little projects. These were properties worth something. A lot of something. I stopped on the latest appraisal report and read the number twice just to be sure. $2.4 million in equity, paid in full. No liens, no debt. I leaned back in my chair, stunned. The ceiling fan above me hummed as though it had known the truth all along. Mark left me for being ordinary. His family dismissed me as poor. Yet sitting on that table was proof that I had built more wealth, more security, more future than he would ever touch in his shiny new life with Sophia. And the best part? They had no idea. I laughed then, not bitterly, but with a strange lightness I hadn't felt in months. It wasn't loud, it wasn't wild, just a quiet laugh that tasted like freedom. That night, instead of crying into the silence, I poured myself a glass of cold coffee left over from the morning and pulled the folder closer. I flipped page after page, reacquainting myself with the life I had built in the shadows. There were sketches I had once drawn on napkins during hospital lunch breaks, plans for renovations, layouts for kitchens and living rooms I hoped to restore. There were sticky notes in my own handwriting, reminding me to call inspectors, to check roofing bids, to never let anyone convince me I was naive. I had forgotten how much of myself I had poured into these projects. Not just money, but resilience, creativity, faith. For years, I thought silence was strength. I thought blending into the background was grace. But maybe strength was what I had been doing all along, quietly building, investing, proving without ever needing to announce it. The numbers didn't lie, and neither did the deeds. My phone buzzed. A message lit up the screen from an old colleague I hadn't spoken to in years. "Have you seen Sophia's latest post? She tagged you." I hesitated, then opened the app. There she was, Sophia, in a white dress, flashing an engagement ring the size of a marble. The caption read, "He finally found someone worthy. Can't wait for our big day." And there, at the bottom, my name tagged like I was some forgotten footnote. My chest tightened, but this time it wasn't pain. It was resolve. I closed the app, deleted it from my phone, and whispered to the empty room, "You left me for being poor, Mark. And now you're marrying poor. You just don't know it yet." It didn't even sound bitter. It sounded true. That was the moment I made my decision. I wasn't going to stay home nursing old wounds while they paraded their happiness in front of me. I wasn't going to let Margaret's smug little note define me as some outsider too broken to show her face. No, I would attend. Not in anger, not to scream or make a scene, but to stand tall, to remind them with nothing but my presence that they had underestimated the wrong woman. I walked to the counter, pulled out the RSVP card, and wrote 3 simple words in neat block letters. "I will attend." Then, underlined once, a single word more. "Alone." No flourish, no apology, just truth. When I sealed the envelope and dropped it into the outgoing mail slot the next morning, I felt something shift inside me. The same silence that once felt suffocating now felt like armor. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying shame. I wasn't carrying fear. I was carrying power, and soon they would see it. The days leading up to the wedding felt different. The silence of my apartment, once heavy and suffocating, now carried a strange calm. It wasn't loneliness anymore. It was focus. I pulled the black folder out every night, not because I needed to remind myself of the numbers, but because I wanted to remember the journey. Each page told a story of resilience, the duplex I bought with my grandmother's inheritance, the triplex I fought city inspectors over until they finally approved the permits, the single-family house that looked like nothing more than a pile of rotting wood until I made it livable again. Those houses, those papers, those deeds, they weren't just investments. They were proof. Proof that I had built something lasting while Mark and his family dismissed me as background noise. I didn't need to flaunt wealth, but I also wasn't going to show up to their fairy tale wedding looking like a ghost of the woman they had mocked. No, I would arrive as myself, strong, steady, and unshaken. I started with the smallest details. From the back of a drawer, I pulled out a tube of red lipstick I hadn't worn in years. Margaret once sneered at it during a dinner, saying, "That shade is a bit young for you, don't you think?" I twisted the cap and watched the scarlet tip catch the light. Bold, unapologetic. I pressed it to my lips slowly. No trembling this time. No second guessing. In the mirror above my sink, I saw someone I hadn't recognized in a long time. Not the nurse dragging herself home after endless shifts. Not the wife bending to please a family that never accepted her. No, this was Susan Whitmore, unashamed and steady. Next came the dress. I didn't buy sequins or satin or anything designed to scream for attention. I chose a simple navy wool dress, cut clean at the knee, paired with a tailored coat that cinched at the waist. It wasn't loud, it wasn't trendy. It was the kind of outfit you wear not to impress, but to remind the world you no longer need approval. For shoes, I picked black leather pumps, comfortable, elegant, timeless. I wasn't there to compete with Sophia's glitter or Margaret's pearls. I was there to stand as myself, and that was enough. Booking the trip was the last step. I opened my laptop late one night, the glow of the screen painting the room in pale blue. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitation rising for just a second. Then I typed the destination, Colorado Springs. The wedding was to be held at a resort nestled in the mountains, all glass and stone and manicured lawns meant to look effortless. Mark always loved appearances. I scrolled past economy fares without pause. Not this time. I clicked on first class, selected a window seat, and confirmed the reservation. It wasn't about the legroom or champagne. It was about the message, even if no one else saw it. I was stepping into this moment on my own terms. The night before I left, I pulled out the RSVP card stub I had kept. I will attend. Alone. The words steadied me. I thought back to the countless nights when I had believed silence meant strength, when I had swallowed comments, endured insults, and told myself that staying quiet was noble. But as I packed my suitcase, carefully folding the dress and slipping the lipstick into a side pocket, I realized the truth. Silence isn't always strength. Sometimes it's surrender. But this time, my silence would be different. It wouldn't be submission. It would be power. The morning of my flight, I rose before dawn. The city was still asleep, streets slick from overnight rain, the air cool and damp. I brewed a cup of coffee and stood by the window, watching the sky shift from gray to pale pink. I thought about everything that had brought me here. The years of sacrifice, the long shifts at the hospital, the nights scrubbing mold from walls and negotiating with contractors who thought I was naive. I thought about Margaret's smirk, Mark's dismissive words, Sophia's glittering laughter, and then I thought about the folder on my table, thick with proof of everything they had overlooked. I smiled softly, a smile no one else could see. At the airport, I didn't rush. I moved with the kind of calm that comes from knowing you have nothing left to prove. Boarding the plane, I slid into my seat, glanced out the window, and let the hum of the engines soothe me. The flight attendant asked if I'd like a drink. I shook my head and whispered, "Just water, thank you." My throat was already clear. As the plane lifted above the clouds, I closed my eyes and pictured the resort waiting in Colorado. White chairs lined under a floral arch, a room full of faces that once looked through me. I wasn't going to scream, I wasn't going to fight, I was simply going to arrive. When we landed, the mountains stretched across the horizon like a promise. A black car waited at the curb, arranged through a friend of mine who owed me a favor. The driver opened the door, but I didn't hurry. I adjusted my gloves, smoothed my coat, and stepped forward. The wind was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and snow. For the first time in a long time, I inhaled deeply, without fear. I wasn't here for revenge. I was here to remember who I had always been, long before they tried to convince me otherwise. And tomorrow, they would see her. The morning of the wedding was crisp and bright, the kind of mountain morning where the air feels sharper than glass. I woke before the sun, not from nerves, but from clarity. Today wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about them. It was about me, finally stepping into the truth I had built all along. Steam curled from my coffee mug as I stood by the hotel window, gazing down at the snow-covered lawns where rows of white chairs had been arranged beneath a floral arch. From up here, it looked picture perfect, but I knew the ground beneath that beauty told another story. At exactly 11 o'clock, I slipped on my navy coat, touched the red lipstick that still held its edge from the night before, and walked out the door. The resort lobby buzzed with chatter and perfume. Guests in pearls and tailored suits moved with the air of people who believed they belonged. A few glanced my way, their expression shifting as recognition flickered. Some whispered, some stiffened. I didn't respond. My silence was enough. When I reached the ceremony lawn, the shuttle bus had just unloaded a group of guests. They clutched their programs and moved toward the seating, like actors filing onto a stage. But when the black town car pulled up behind them and I stepped out, the air shifted. It wasn't loud, no gasps, no screams, just a ripple, like the hush before a storm. "Is that her?" someone whispered. "She wasn't supposed to come," another murmured. I didn't look left or right. I simply adjusted my gloves, lifted my chin, and walked toward the front. A staff member with a headset appeared, flustered. "Miss Whitmore, right this way." Her voice carried a nervous edge, like she had been warned about me. She led me past rows of guests, their eyes tracking me the way you'd watch a flame move through a room full of dry wood. When I reached the front row, I sat. Not in the shadows, not at the margins, but in the seat they had hoped I would never claim. The music began, light strings floating in the cold mountain air. The bridal party entered, dresses shimmering like frost, smiles rehearsed and steady. Sophia appeared last, radiant in lace and satin, her hand clutching a bouquet of pale roses. Mark stood at the altar, tall, proud, his jaw tight as he spotted me. For a moment, his face drained of color. Then he forced a smile, as if to reassure the guests that nothing was wrong. But his hand trembled when he reached for Sophia's. The officiant cleared his throat, opened his folder, and began the ceremony. His words floated over the crowd, but no one was listening. Not really. All eyes darted between me and the couple, between the silence I carried and the vows they tried to speak. Then it happened. Halfway through the reading, a resort manager in a dark suit approached the altar. He bent low, speaking quickly into the officiant's ear. Confusion flickered across the man's face as he looked from the note in his hand to the couple before him. I'm afraid we need to pause for just a moment," the officiant stammered. The crowd murmured, shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. Sophia's smile faltered. Mark's grip tightened around her hand. The manager cleared his throat. "It appears there has been a change in the property's usage rights. Effective as of this morning, this venue is no longer authorized for private events." Gasps rippled through the guests. Confusion turned to panic. Heads swiveled. Whispers spread like wildfire. And then, slowly, inevitably, their eyes landed on me. I didn't stand. I didn't smirk. I simply tilted my head, calm and steady, the way you do when you've been underestimated for too long. Margaret's face turned white. She leaned toward Sophia, hissing something sharp, her composure cracking for the first time. Sophia's bouquet trembled in her hands. Mark's mouth opened, but no words came. I finally spoke, my voice low, even, carrying just enough to be heard by those nearest. "It's funny, isn't it? What people call poor, until they learn whose name is on the deed." Silence. You could hear the wind rustling the floral arch. For years they had mocked me, dismissed me, erased me. And now, without raising my voice, I had turned their perfect day into a stage for their own arrogance. The officiant shuffled his papers, unsure whether to continue. Guests whispered, some pulling out their phones, others exchanging looks that said everything without a word. I stood then, not dramatically, not with triumph, but with quiet certainty. "I was invited," I said simply, meeting Margaret's stunned gaze. "This land belongs to me. I suppose someone should have checked the paperwork." A few nervous laughs slipped through the crowd, the kind that covered discomfort more than humor. Mark's jaw clenched. Sophia's eyes darted wildly as if searching for a door that didn't exist, but I didn't wait for their response. I turned, smoothed the front of my coat, and walked back down the aisle. This time, not as a discarded wife, not as an outsider, but as the woman they never thought I could be. As I reached the edge of the patio, the murmurs behind me swelled into chaos. Guests demanded answers. Margaret shouted at the planner. Mark stood frozen at the altar, his perfect day crumbling around him. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply stepped aside, accepted a glass of water from a passing server, and let the storm rage behind me. Because true power doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just arrives. And on that mountain morning, I finally arrived. I didn't look back as I left the ceremony lawn. The sound of raised voices carried through the cold mountain air. Margaret snapping at the wedding planner, Sophia's father demanding answers, guests murmuring in confusion, but none of it belonged to me anymore. I walked slowly, the crunch of snow beneath my shoes steady and grounding. For years, I had been the woman who shrank into corners, who bit her tongue to keep the peace. Today, I walked away, knowing peace was something they could never take from me again. Inside the lodge, the fireplace crackled. A server approached timidly, offering champagne. I shook my head with a soft smile. Water is fine. My throat was clear. I didn't need bubbles to feel the lift in my chest. I sat near the window, watching the scene unravel below. Guests shuffled back toward shuttles, clutching coats against the cold. Some shook their heads, some laughed quietly, others filmed with their phones. What was meant to be a perfect wedding had turned into a spectacle, and I hadn't lifted more than a finger. Later, I returned to my suite. I slipped off my coat, unzipped my shoes, and let them rest by the fire. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a woman trying to prove her worth. I felt like myself, just Susan, whole and steady. I poured a glass of tea, leaned back into the couch, and thought about what had happened. I hadn't humiliated them. They had done that themselves by building a life on arrogance and appearances. All I did was stop protecting them from the truth. For so long, I had carried their insults like stones in my pockets, weighing me down. But tonight, it felt like I had finally set them down, one by one, until I could stand tall again. The next morning, the mountains greeted me with silence. Snow glistened in the early light, and the air was so crisp it stung my lungs in the best way. I brewed coffee in the small sweet kitchen and carried the mug to the balcony. Down below, workers were dismantling the arch, folding up chairs, sweeping away petals that still clung to the frozen ground. What had been the stage of their grand performance yesterday was now nothing but a cleanup site. It struck me then how quickly illusions fade, how something that looks perfect one moment can collapse the next when built on shaky ground. By noon, the internet had already done what it does best. Clips from the ceremony circulated online, shaky videos of Margaret's outrage, Sophia's stunned expression, and Mark's pale face. Strangers added captions, music, commentary. Some called me ruthless, others called me dignified. One comment stood out. She didn't say much, but she didn't have to. Power doesn't always speak loud. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Instead, I packed my things. My dress folded neatly, the lipstick placed back into its tube, the RSVP stub tucked into the black folder as a reminder. When I checked out of the hotel, the concierge looked at me with something like respect. "Safe travels, Ms. Whitmore," he said quietly, as though he knew he'd just witnessed something worth remembering. Back in Portland, the air smelled of rain, damp pavement, and fresh beginnings. I drove home slowly, past neighborhoods where I had once bid on forgotten houses, past streets that still held pieces of my past. When I pulled into the driveway of my own home, a modest but solid house I had renovated myself, I felt a swell of gratitude. Not for the wealth, not for the property deeds, but for the journey that had carried me here. On the porch, I carried out a box I had kept tucked in the closet for years. Inside were old letters, photos, mementos from my marriage to Mark. At the very top sat my wedding ring, small and gold, once heavy with meaning. I walked down to the edge of the river behind my house. The water moved steadily, reflecting the gray sky. I held the ring in my palm for a moment, feeling its weight one last time. Then I opened my hand. It slipped into the water with barely a sound. No tears, no ceremony, just peace. That evening, I sat by the fire in my own living room, tea in hand. The world outside continued as always. Traffic, phones buzzing, people scrolling through gossip online. But inside, all was still. I thought about Mark. I thought about Sophia. I thought about Margaret. And then, for the first time, I let them go. Not with anger, not with bitterness, but with freedom. Because the truth is, I didn't ruin their wedding. I didn't destroy their plans. They did that themselves by underestimating the wrong woman. All I did was show up. As the fire crackled low, I whispered into the quiet, I don't need revenge. I just need truth. And sometimes, the richest thing you can be is free. And with that, I leaned back, pulled the blanket over my knees, and let the silence, this time a kind of silence I chose, wrap around me. Not the silence of being unseen, not the silence of being dismissed, but the silence of finally being at peace. What about you? Have you ever been underestimated or had to stand your ground against people who once called you family? Share your experience in the comments below. If Susan's quiet strength inspired you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss more stories like this, where dignity always finds its voice. Because at the end of the day, weddings can collapse, fortunes can fade, but your self-respect, that's yours to guard. Always.